Further damage to Mountbatten's reputation came with Andrew Roberts' collection, Eminent Churchillian, which included a scathing essay, Lord Mountbatten and the Perils of Adrenaline, describing him as a mendacious, intellectually limited hustler, promoted wildly above his abilities, with consistently disastrous consequences, which argued for Mountbatten's impeachment over the partition of India. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to finish the Mountbattens today. So this is the last chapter, which talks about his legacy. And of course, we know that as long as he was alive, his reputation was very carefully curated. But when he died, that gave people a lot of room to finally come out and say, that guy was such a liar. Like, everything he said was hyperbolic and exaggerated, and he was constantly bragging about himself. And if he ever told you anything, you need to make sure that you had it verified by another source, because as long as he could get you to buy that he was the top dog and that he'd made all the best decisions and that he was the best person in the whole world, he would do it. So this chapter really sort of discusses the crumbling of that reputation that he had so carefully curated, and also the difficulty, and to this day, getting the facts about Mountbatten. It's shocking to me that even so long after this person has passed away, even so long after many of the players in the stories have passed away, that there are still pivotal documents that researchers cannot get their hands on. They're allowed to look at all the sanitized stuff. But when it comes to the personal diaries, letters, all of the communication that would actually give you a really valid idea of who both Louis was and Edwina, you can't get your hands on it. And I just think that I understand that they may be embarrassing or off color or whatever. But for the sake of history, to continue to shield and shroud and make sure that this person's legacy lives on, well, if they wanted their legacy to live on, then they've got to make the right decisions in life. And I'm really, really, really disgusted by historians who allow a lie to continue on and to propagate. For what? Like, why are we doing that? How does it help posterity to lie about the people in history? Anyway. The fact that this author was able to write a book with such an in-depth picture of both Dickie and Edwina is really a testament to his ability to research. And I can't believe he was able to do such a good job. But even with that being said, there's still such a side to Mountbatten that we never will understand. And I found myself continually frustrated reading this, because it does feel like we're never actually finding out who he is. There's just a line you're dancing the whole time you're reading about him of, well, he said this, other people said this, it looks like this, but it might not be. His personality told me this, but it also told me this. It's like he's such a shadowy figure that I was constantly frustrated by this slippery feeling that I had the whole time I was reading it, that I just could not pin him down in any context. Very frustrating. I think the one thing we know is that he was an exaggerator and a liar, but that doesn't really tell me all that I want to know about him. This chapter was, I thought, very interesting as it sort of finishes telling the story and sort of settles the score on some of these counts, as far as what we do know, what we don't know, and what people were really thinking about Dickie in real life. Okay, chapter 29, it's our last chapter. It's entitled Legacy. After his death, various ideas were put forward to commemorate Mountbatten, including a statue on the extra plinth in Trafalgar Square, the foundation of a chair of Commonwealth history, with bursaries along the lines of the Rhodes Trust, and even that the August bank holiday be known as Mountbatten Day, though this was dismissed as it would be better to commemorate Lord Batten through a memorial which related to his achievements rather than one which drew attention to his death. Instead, the Mountbatten Memorial Trust was set up to support the charitable organizations with which he had been most associated, especially technological research and support for the United World Colleges movement. Eventually, it was also agreed to erect a bronze statue on Foreign Office Green, overlooking Horse Guards. In November 1983, Her Majesty the Queen unveiled the 9-foot memorial statue by the Czech sculptor Franta Belsky of Mountbatten as Admiral of the Fleet, standing holding binoculars with eyes fixed on the old Admiralty building. In her speech, she paid tribute to her husband's uncle. Why was it that the moment Lord Mountbatten came through the door it seemed he filled the room? It was first and foremost the vitality and force of his personality, combined with an astonishing range of abilities. He could be far-sighted with enormous breadth of vision, and yet he could also concentrate on the minutest detail of any problem, a perfectionist who always mastered his subject. Add to this unfailing courage, immense charm, and a never-flagging determination to get his way, and you have a truly formidable character. Above all, he was a natural leader who managed to convey to those who worked with him his sense of enthusiasm and dedication. In July 1980, Dick Huff's biography appeared with a 3-day serialization in the Sunday Telegraph. Even though the book was a broadly sympathetic account and made little reference to his private life, the Broadlands Archives trustees, led by John Brabourne, took exception to Huff's claim that it was authorized. Mountbatten had given him many hours of interviews, but it was for a book on his parents, to protect the official biography of Philip Ziegler. They fought a high court battle, which they won, requiring Huff to deposit all his material with them, material that is still not publicly available, and to pay legal costs of £20,000. The final order was so secret that it was made in chambers rather than open court, and the affidavits kept secret. A penal notice prevented him from even discussing the settlement. What? What an outrageous and ridiculous thing. Why? Why? See, that's what I don't understand. What was it about Mountbatten that made everybody just bend over backwards to keep his secrets? Later in the year, Charles Smith, 50 Years with Mountbatten, a memoir by his butler, and long discussed with Mountbatten, appeared. Smith had begun work as Edwina's traveling footman in 1930, before being made Dickie's valet in 1936, and becoming a butler in 1954. Since his retirement in 1974, he had worked as an archivist and guide. It provided an affectionate portrait of the family and their guests and was never going to land him in high court. In November 1980, Ludovic Kennedy's 6-part television series, Lord Mountbatten Remembers, which had been filmed the previous summer with instructions that it should not be transmitted until after Mountbatten's death, was shown. Interviewed by John Terraine, he reflected on his life and career. Kennedy later wrote, "A working title for it might have been How I Got My Way and Was Proved Right in Everything I Did. Then I remembered Stephen Roskill telling me not to believe a word Mountbatten said or claimed unless it was corroborated with other sources." He nicknamed the program Firm Friends, because Mountbatten would always go above someone's head or threaten resignation, but having won, he would claim, "We became firm friends." This was Mountbatten at his most boastful and ingenuous. Reviewing it, Miles Kington observed, "He reminded me, in fact, of the well-known singer who, when informed of Elvis Presley's death, said, 'Poor Elvis, he was always my greatest fan.'" The most controversial episode was the one devoted to the Suez, because of his criticisms of the then First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Hailsham, and the former Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who were both still alive. Robert Armstrong, the cabinet secretary, later known during the Spycatcher trial for himself being economical with the truth, noted it in an internal memo. There are good reasons for thinking that Lord Mountbatten's account of the matter was in many respects some way from the truth, though I do not suggest that his own view of the matter at the time was other than as he describes it. Armstrong had long sought for the program to be deferred, arguing that it was in breach of confidential relationships laid down in the report of the Privy Council on ministerial memoirs. However, no one was persuaded, as the restrictions were limited to 15 years, and Suez had taken place some 24 years earlier. There were also suggestions that there could be untoward consequences while the situation in the Arab world is as critical as it is at present. But the situation in the Arab world in 1980 was not then critical, and in fact Mountbatten had tried at Suez to dissuade Anthony Eden from attacking the Arabs. Kennedy, exasperated, leaked the transcript to the journalist Bernard Levin, who then wrote up a major feature in the Times, which occasioned a letter from Hailsham refuting Mountbatten's version of Suez. Further complaints followed about his version of other events, notably the sacking of Oliver Leese and the relations with James Somerville during his time as Supreme Allied Commander. Writing to George Howard, chairman of the BBC Governors, Somerville's son noted, quote, "There was more than a touch of Baron Munchausen about Lord Mountbatten." Stephen Roskill summed it up, writing to Somerville's son, quote, "I have done so much to contradict MB that there is, I think, a danger of me being regarded as a professional debunker of him. For instance, I don't know if you belong to the Naval Review, But in that journal, I have recently disproved his claim to have been responsible for the adaptation of the Swiss Oerlikon gun, and almost all who know the true story have supported me. I could give a dozen examples of his utter unreliability on historical issues. In fact, I tell everybody who comes to me on such matters never to rely on his testimony unless it is supported by independent evidence. Perhaps the worst case is the story that at the Second Quebec, he was given authority by the COSS to dismiss any C&C in the SEAC on demand. Mountbatten's carefully nurtured reputation was beginning to be dismantled. In 1985, after 5 years' research, Philip Ziegler's 800-page Official Life of Mountbatten, drawing on unrestricted access to all of the Mountbatten papers, was published. The book, published by Collins, where Ziegler was editor-in-chief and one of the Broadlands Archives trustees, Charles Troughton, was a director, and had been worth £300,000 to him and £300,000 to the Broadlands Archives Trust, with the Sunday Times paying £350,000 for 8 installments to serialize the book. It is a generous and elegant biography, not afraid to pull its punches where criticism is due. Mountbatten's command of the Kelly, his vanity, and mendaciousness, which comprehensively covers Mountbatten's public life, if perhaps hinting more about the private life than he is prepared to reveal. Capitalizing on the publication of the official life and success of his own biography of Dickie, Richard Huff in 1985 published a Life of Edwina, drawing on interviews with her sister Mary. 6 years later came the authorized biography of Edwina by Janet Morgan, commissioned by Philip Ziegler and published by Collins again. Though suffering from no footnotes, it is a shrewd and nuanced account of a complex woman. Anthony Lambton's The Mountbattens, The Battenbergs and Young Mountbatten, the first of a projected 2-volume life, appeared in 1989, concentrating on Mountbatten's genealogy, and arguing that shame at the illegitimacy in his family tree had shaped his character, most notably his vanity and insecurity. Further memoirs by members of staff followed in 1989 and 1991. William Evans had been Mountbatten's valet from 1959 to 1969. His book, My Mountbatten Years in the Service of Lord Louis, provided a discreet but revealing insight into Mountbatten's life after the death of Edwina. Even more revelatory was John Barrett's With the Greatest Respect, a memoir by his secretary subtitled The Private Lives of Earl Mountbatten, which recounted details of Mountbatten's lovers and voyeuristic tendencies. Further damage to Mountbatten's reputation came with Andrew Roberts' collection, Eminent Churchillian, which included a scathing essay, Lord Mountbatten and the Perils of Adrenaline, describing him as a mendacious, intellectually limited hustler, promoted wildly above his abilities, with consistently disastrous consequences, which argued for Mountbatten's impeachment over the partition of India. Within days, Mountbatten, The Private Story, by royal writer Brian Hoey, was published. The book had been commissioned by the Mountbatten family, who felt the Ziegler book had been rather too official. It benefited from interviews with Mountbatten's 2 daughters, his sons-in-law, 8 grandchildren, Sasha Abercorn, King Constantine of Greece, Prince Michael of Kent, and Prince Philip. Its main revelation was Mountbatten's love affair with his goddaughter, Sasha Abercorn. The family have continued to provide their own version of events, downplaying the couple's infidelities, and drawing on their own related stories. These included Tim Knatchbull's moving memoir of the events 1979, From a Clear Blue Sky, published for the 30th anniversary of Mountbatten's murder, and 2 charming memoirs by Lady Pamela Hicks, India Remembered, published in 2007, and Daughters of Empire, published in 2012. Probably the most important of the specialist recent books on the Mountbatten has been Alex von Tüzelmann's critically acclaimed debut in 2007, Indian Summer, The Secret History of the End of an Empire, an examination of the transfer of power, arguing that Mountbatten's poor relationship with Jinnah and closeness to Nehru did affect the details of independence, and Adrian Smith's Mountbatten, Apprentice Warlord, focused on Mountbatten's naval career up to 1943, which appeared in 2010. Many of these books have benefited from the extensive Mountbatten archives at Southampton University, donated on permanent loan in 1989 and purchased in 2010 for £2.85 million, with £1,993,760 alone from the National Heritage Memorial Fund. The archive comprises some 200,000 documents and 50,000 photographs, comprising letters to hundreds of figures, family correspondence, photograph albums, and news cuttings. The Mountbattens at some stages of their lives were in the papers every day, and all was dutifully recorded by press-cutting agencies. Household accounts, shooting game cards, files on each of the myriad organizations with which the couple were involved, letters of condolence, transcripts of the Life and Times television series, and visitor books. Yet the couple's private diaries and letters to each other, plus the letters between Nehru and Edwina, available to the authorized biographers, remain closed to researchers. It appears there are still Mountbatten secrets to be revealed. Like Churchill, Mountbatten wanted to be remembered, and that reputation to be one which he had curated. Fame was to be important to him, not only during his own lifetime, but also afterwards. He was keen to do so, because, as Pat McClellan noted, his public image, far-sighted, imaginative, bold, dynamic, charismatic, and vigorous, was not shared by many of those who competed with him, and who regarded him as devious, vain, imperious, unscrupulous, and unprincipled. In fact, privately, he was kind, charming, sentimental, witty, and magnetic. Friends were deployed to support his version of events, later a role taken on by his family. The Mountbatten daughters seek to obscure three aspects of their parents: their mother's physical relationships with, quote, men of color, her perjury, and both their parents' bisexuality, wrote Charlotte Breese in her biography Hutch. While I did not seek definite proof of any of these, all three are evident from existing research in other books and from people I have interviewed. The family, first daughters and now grandchildren, constantly denied Dickie's bisexuality and the extent and range of both their love affairs, though the story kept changing. Edwina's relationship with Nehru was impossible, first because it was platonic and then because he was impotent. Lady Pamela Hicks and the authorized Edwina biographer Janet Morgan suggest that most of Edwina's affairs were simply unconsummated romantic flirtations. Yeah, right. Why would you have these long, protracted affairs in which you're traveling to see the person and you're hanging out with the person, you're obsessed with the person? You're going to tell me that it never came to sex? You're literally leaving your husband and your family to go on vacation with this other guy, but it's just because you guys were such good friends. Please. According to Pamela Hicks, her mother had at least 18 lovers, but my father, to my knowledge, only had one other. Yet Dickie's authorized biographer, Philip Ziegler, almost 30 years earlier, had concluded, quote, he conducted at least 2 protracted love affairs outside his marriage, to the apparent satisfaction of both parties. But he was never promiscuous. Though he liked to imagine himself a sexual athlete, he seems to have had, in fact, only slight enthusiasm for the sport. He loved the company of women, sought their affection, and had an almost irresistible urge to use them as confidants, but his energies were channeled into his working life. We've already established that Philip Ziegler, I think, had a little bit of a rose-colored glasses when he looked at Dickie, because I think there's a lot of evidence that he was indeed promiscuous. Maybe not with women. Anyway, the book goes on to say that he devotes a single paragraph to his subject's mistress of 40 years, with no reference to anyone else. According to John Barrett, his employer, although, quote, he had quite a number of sexual liaisons, he seemed to be quite happy, even during the years he was married, with long periods of celibacy. Amongst the 4,000 files at Southampton University, there are few hints of the couple's extramarital relationships. Yeah, I bet, because that collection has been scrubbed of anything remarkably interesting. I also think that this John Barrett can't be considered as an excellent source on his employer, because he also denied the fact that Mountbatten had a lot of male lovers, and some of them quite young, up to the house, and everybody else knew it was happening, yet his personal secretary denies it. I think that personal secretary was in the business of protecting his employer's reputation. Anyway, part of the control of the Mountbatten legacy has been exercised by withholding permission and material, much of which still remains in the archives at Broadlands, or close under a ministerial director at the Hartley Library. Lambton, one of the many writers to suffer from these controls, reflected, quote, it made me draw the conclusion that every author who was not prepared to accept the Mountbatten myth would be starved of information. In the past, the favored few were fed with carefully selected passages. Dickie's wartime and post-war career remains controversial. Debate continues about his effectiveness at Combined Operations, Southeast Asia Command, as Viceroy, First Sea Lord, and Chief of the Defense Staff. Was he over-promoted by his mentor Churchill and given jobs because of his connection and public relations skills? Or was he an aspiring leader who could be trusted to get things done? For David Cannadine, there was about almost everything Mountbatten did an element of the makeshift, the insubstantial, the incomplete, and the disingenuous, a disquieting gap between the promise and the performance that no amount of bravura on his part could ever quite conceal. To a naval colleague, however, he was, quote, a single-minded enthusiast in everything he took up and endowed with boundless energy and ability. I am sure that no one in the fleet, even in those early days, doubted that he would go right to the top, and deservedly so on his own merits. His record is not clear-cut, Dieppe may have been poorly planned, but it is unfair to blame Mountbatten entirely. Many of the fateful decisions were not his own, and though the Dieppe disaster overshadows his time at combined operations, it is generally acknowledged that he did build a totally inter-service organization, which not only kept pressure on German forces but prepared the way, not least with his encouragement of technical developments for the unsuccessful D-Day landings. In spite of being deprived of the necessary resources to wage the sort of campaign he would have liked in Burma, he did restore the fighting spirit. Bill Slim and his generals were the military brains, but it was Mountbatten's leadership that allowed them to flourish. His appointment, with its confused command structure and diplomatic sensitivities, was a political rather than a military one, and on that score he acquitted himself well. He may have fallen out with various of his generals, and relations with the Americans were strained at times, but in a difficult situation he kept the show on the road. The ends of wars are messy affairs. There are huge logistical problems of demobbing troops, rescuing prisoners of war, repatriating captured soldiers, and rebuilding devastated areas. Both Mountbattens rose to the challenges, and this was perhaps their finest hour, with Dickey's decision to work with nationalists, proving to be pragmatic and far-sighted. The rapid transfer of power, Indian partition, and subsequent communal violence and problems in Kashmir continue to be debated. Faced with the instability of the interim government, the breakdown in British administration, the Indian impatience for independence, rising communal violence, and a brief to hand over power with as much dignity as possible from a British government with other priorities, Mountbatten had little choice. Rushing partition was tactical, to concentrate minds, demonstrate good faith, and narrow options, but also if he had not rushed it, there would have been no power to hand over. It is certainly not the case that Mountbatten brought it forward so he could return to the Navy sooner. If that was true, he would not have stayed on as Governor-General. Indeed, his reputation might be higher now than if he had left in August 1947. Yes, the Mountbattens probably did show favoritism towards Nehru and the Hindus, but Jinnah had not been an easy person with whom to deal. Mountbatten was charmed by the old Harrovian and fellow Cambridge alumnus, Nehru, whereas in spite of a genuine effort, he was never able to establish the same close relationship with Jinnah. On such personal matters, history can be shaped. Now, this next bit is very interesting because I think that it is probably one of the few times that Mountbatten let his guard down and told the truth about what he thought his performance had been. The book says that according to the BBC journalist John Osman, sitting next to Mountbatten in the officers' mess of the lifeguards at Windsor and chatting about his time in India, quote, "Speaking with a frankness that surprised me, Mountbatten blamed himself, saying how he had, quote, got things wrong. To this day, his own judgment on how he had performed in India rings in my ears and in my memory. As one who dislikes the tasteless use in writing of the dictionary's vulgar slang word, I shall permit myself an exception this time, because it is the only honest way of reporting accurately what the last Viceroy of India thought about the way he had done his job. Fucked it up. Is this fair? On the criteria set up for him on going out as Viceroy, unitary government by June 1948, fair and just arrangements for princes, the closest cooperation with the Indians, and no break in the continuity of the Indian army, Mountbatten had failed. Over 1 million people had died in the Punjab, in spite of the repeated warnings from various government officials, and many might have been saved if the boundaries had been clear, but he had delivered his brief. Mountbatten's scorecard at the Ministry of Defense is mixed. He did integrate the 3 armed services and made tough choices about Britain's nuclear deterrent, but he was simply a public servant reporting to politicians who created policy, and he incurred unnecessary unpopularity along the way for his ruthless ambition and rather unsophisticated plotting. As Field Marshal Sir Francis Festing told Field Marshal Lord Carver, "If the front door was wide open, Dickey would still prefer to come down the chimney." Mountbatten was a man full of contradictions. Self-confident in public life, he was insecure when it came to his private life and relations with his wife. Able to think outside the box and see the big picture, he was obsessed with trivial detail, often to do with his own personal appearance or prestige. Always immaculately dressed and handsome in the correct uniform, he had no taste when it came to casual dress. With his lack of empathy and concern with detail, his eggs had to be cooked for exactly 1.5 minutes after being plunged into boiling water, there appear to be hints of autism and narcissism in his makeup. No one disputes the vanity born of his insecurity. Ludovic Kennedy, a fellow speaker at a naval dinner in Newcastle in 1975, having arranged to meet him at a local hotel, reports that he put his head gingerly round the semi-open door. There I saw an unusual sight. The Admiral, in shirt-sleeves and braces, sitting aside a very low dressing-room stool, and gazing keenly at his reflection in the mirror, the ADC on his knees behind him, brushing the curls at the back of his head. What a strangeness. His obsession with uniforms and decorations was legendary. Harold Macmillan is supposed to have muttered to Courtier after a Silver Jubilee celebration lunch at the Guildhall, "I hope you'll give us all a medal. Dick, you'll be so disappointed if you don't." John Festing, son of Field Marshal Frankie Festing, tells similar stories of Mountbattens persuading the powers that be to give him certain key jobs to his father's detriment, and inviting himself to memorial events when he had conspicuously not been invited. I suspect that he was a very unusual man and a bit more Germanic than he would like people to know. Pat Macmillan, the former military assistant to Mountbatten, agrees, quote, "He was different because he was Hanoverian. He had a Teutonic determination. He never actually fitted in. He didn't play by the same rules as other naval officers. Above all, he wanted to be accepted. How to prove you're better than everyone else is by getting to the top." As Mountbatten confessed to one of his wartime generals, Philip Christensen, while trying to get him to take responsibility for one of his mistakes. "Christy, you know how my father was treated when World War I came. Ever since that disgraceful episode, I have lived determined to get to the top and vindicate his memory. Nothing and no one, I repeat, nothing and no one will ever be allowed to stand in my way." What had driven him was partially the desire to avenge family honor, partially a deep insecurity that required constant adulation. Where his career was concerned, nothing else mattered, thought his son-in-law David Hicks. He could be a complete bastard. It was something Mountbatten recognized himself. "I know what I want, and I go for it, and I am ruthless. If anybody stands in my way, I circumvent them if I can't finish them off." Having achieved his lifetime's ambition, even when he retired, he was driven partially by a strong sense of public duty and noblesse oblige, partly by loneliness and a need to keep himself busy and wanted. He'd married one of the most beautiful and richest women in the world, yet it was not the great love match for which he had perhaps hoped. That was reserved for his eldest daughter. Part of the reason for the failure of his marriage may have been the dark secret about his own sexuality, unknown until now, but his sense of inadequacy in his private life found an outlet in his determination for public life. The story of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten is almost the story of the 20th century. Both were born at the turn of the century, and their lives touched many of the greatest events of the period, or intertwined with the dominating figures of the time. Their biographies have a great narrative symmetry divided by the war. Until then, Edwina was a rich little girl lost, who sought release and escape with lovers and travel. Dickie was a hard-working naval officer who may eventually have made flag rank. The war changed their lives irretrievably, catapulting them into positions of fame and influence. Edwina's reputation is secure, universally admired and loved. An aimless youth was transformed into a middle age of lasting accomplishments as a humanitarian. Difficult, complex, determined to emerge from the shadow of her husband, she proved herself more than his equal in intellect and achievement, and her influence on him in public life has been underrated. She was quicker and more intelligent than her husband, the politician Woodrow Wyatt remembered, and understood politics better. She had continually advanced Dickie's career, whether sweet-talking King George VI to give her husband a DSO, or viscountcy, persuading Nehru to accept the partition plan, or the Admiralty Board to promote him. Her husband's reputation is less clear. Mountbatten loved to portray himself as a player on the world stage who had changed nations. He wanted to take credit for events, inventions, operations to which he was not fully entitled, and even when they did not always reflect well on him, such as the Dipe. Always desperate for attention, even if it was not always admiring, he skillfully used PR agents to promote himself at the expense of others, and together with colleagues and family carefully curated how he would be remembered. Living longer than most of his wartime colleagues made it easier to shape the narrative as he wished. The reality, especially as Supreme Commander and Viceroy, was that he was subject to wider underlying historical currents. Given America called the shots in Southeast Asia, there was little Mountbatten could do except abide by their wishes. Given the positions adopted by Congress and Jinnah, partition was inevitable even before Mountbatten arrived in India. He was good at dressing up his role and spinning his apparent influence, but he was really just a front-of-house manager to make sure everyone remained happy. The irony is that the strings were being pulled elsewhere. That's the end. Wow. That person, I don't think I've ever read about somebody as complicated as him. I mean, on every single aspect of his life, that person was not what he seemed to be. Not in his marriage, not in his work, not as a father. Because even his relationship with the daughter was very strange. I feel like the definitive biography on him is yet to come. Though I think this author did a superb job in what he was able to get. Just like he said, there's just so many documents, so much truth that is still hiding behind doors owned by people who do not want the truth to come out. And I'm sure that even if we had access to all those things, even if we had access to all the letters that he ever had written, every single one of them, I doubt very much that he was even honest in his letters. He seems like the sort of person that kept diaries with the express purpose of lying to future generations who might stumble upon them. It's like, he's the sort of person who keeps a diary not as a means of recording what really happened, but as a way of shaping the future impression of him. And so I don't think that his letters probably reflected all that much truth either. I think Edwina's letters, though, were probably fairly close to the truth because she doesn't seem like she was ashamed of who she was. Like, this is who I am. I don't need to pretend to be anything else. If you have a problem with it, that sounds like a you problem, not a me problem. So I would love to have more access to what she was writing about. But I just don't know when that day will ever come. And, this goes even here in the States. There's just so many documents from historical events that the layperson is not allowed to see, and I find that reprehensible. History belongs to everybody, not to the rich and powerful few who are able to keep a throttle hold on those documents and on that truth. And it's just very, very upsetting that we still live in a time in which there's still powerful people that keep, the everyman from knowing what's really happened. I find it absolutely unacceptable. And I really feel like it's things like that. Like, people need to revolt against things like that. I'm not saying we need to have bloodshed in the streets, but, greater wars were fought over less. You can't hide from the people what has happened to them and why their lives look the way they do because of certain people pulling strings in the background. And I'm just very, very, very annoyed by things like that. As a consequence, too, it's like we have biographers like this author who are trying to tell us the history and are doing a superb job with what they're able to get, but they're being stymied. And I know that he, in working on his book on Prince Andrew, has come up against the same problem. Extreme difficulties getting his hands on documents about events that affect the people. And these people in higher up positions who are just allowed to live their life however they want, and there's a whole team of people who will hide all their mistakes and lock up documents and lock up sources and lock up information. That's not helping the globe. That's not helping the people who live on this planet. To have a whole team of people who will continually cover up the mistakes of the powerful and the wealthy and the elite. It's disgusting and it's sickening, and people should rise up against it. Anyway, that's my little spiel. I hope you guys enjoyed that book. But next week I'll have our next book. I'm thinking to announce it on Wednesday. So hopefully I can come up with something by then. All right, you guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me, especially for this book. And I so appreciate those of you who are patient with me as, life and changes and everything made it so that this book took much longer than it needed to take. But I so appreciate your patience. I so appreciate your interest in true history. And I would love to continue this theme of having like fun, silly, stupid stuff on the channel, but also some actually good historical biographies for those of us who want something a little bit meatier. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me and for getting into the meatier biographies with me. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Bye.